This is a true story that my grandmother told me. After taking a shower, I lit a mosquito repellent coil and placed it in front of the house, where my grandmother was lying on a wooden chair. It was the third summer of my university years. I had been unlucky in finding a part-time job, as no place seemed to accept me. With little money left, I had to pack up and return to my hometown. As always, when I went back to the countryside, I went straight to my grandmother's house. Since she lived alone, I wanted to stay with her to have someone to talk to and provide additional warmth to the house of a woman in her 70s. My parents had been divorced for almost 2 years, and initially, my grandmother lived with my mother to take care of my younger brother, who was only 6 years old. However, due to the gossip from the neighbors and the influence of others, my grandmother found it difficult to handle the situation. As a result, she moved all the ancestral altars back to her own house. Since then, my grandmother has been living alone, and my mother and aunts frequently visited her, but only those who truly understood her could grasp her loneliness. I placed the mosquito coil at my feet and pulled a stool to sit beside my grandmother. I fixed my eyes on my phone's screen, as if waiting for a message from someone. My grandmother turned to look at me and asked, "You're not working this year?" I replied, "It's been 8 months since I last came home. I'll stay with you for a while, and then I'll continue my studies. Once I graduate next year, I won't have summer breaks anymore, so I won't have time to visit." My grandmother gazed into the distance, towards the yard, and sighed, I'm afraid I won't see you anymore after this year." I waved my hand dismissively and said, "Grandma, don't say that. I heard from Mom that you can still walk 5 kilometers to the market. With your strength, you'll live to be 100. My grandmother sadly said, "In life, no one knows what will happen, my child. Would you like to hear the story of when I was in a coma? Shall I tell you?" The story of her 12 days and nights in a coma was something my grandmother had told me since I was a child. "But this time," she added, "this is the first time I'm telling you this story. I have never told anyone before." Like a professional storyteller, my grandmother began to recount the story. When my grandmother was 31 years old, my grandfather unfortunately stepped on a hidden landmine in the bushes and passed away. He left my grandmother with a sole inheritance, which was 5 children. The eldest daughter was 12 years old, and the 2 youngest daughters were still being cradled in her arms. My father was the 4th child, and he was the only son in the family. Life became even more difficult when my great-grandfather expelled my grandmother's entire family from their home, leaving them with nowhere to stay. The 6 of them sought shelter at my maternal great-grandparents' house, and my grandmother worked hard to save enough money to build a small thatched house of their own. Despite the hardships, my grandmother was a strong and capable woman. She took on various jobs to support the family of 6. Every Tet holiday, she made sure her children had new clothes. Life went on, not excessively difficult but not smooth either. One afternoon, after finishing her work in the field, my grandmother began her journey back home. The road from the fields to the house was not too far, and she had walked a short distance when suddenly everything turned dark. The sky became pitch black as if someone had pulled a veil over it. Her ears started ringing, and she felt a sharp pain in her head before fainting, losing consciousness. When she woke up, the sky was still bright. She gathered her belongings in her hoe and continued on her way back home. However, today the path from the field seemed strange. The houses on either side of the road had vanished, and a new thatched roof house with 2 sections had appeared. The once lush paddy fields had transformed into an empty barren land, overgrown with wild grass and trees. Feeling something was amiss, my grandmother hurriedly made her way straight home. But the more she walked, the more unfamiliar the surroundings became. The wide stone path turned into a muddy road. The thatched roof houses seemed dilapidated and nothing like their former grandeur. As she retraced her memories, my grandmother realized that she might have traveled back in time, witnessing scenes from many years ago. As night fell and worried for her children at home who had not yet had dinner, my grandmother ran in the direction of her house, but to her surprise, she couldn't find it. She ran back and forth several times, but it was nowhere to be seen. Mr. Ba's house was clearly on the left, Mrs. High's house on the right, but her own house was nowhere to be found. Panicking as darkness enveloped the sky, my grandmother continued walking in fear. After a while, she saw a towering building in front of her, with an unknown number of floors, painted in dark red, black-tiled roof, wooden door with a large handle resembling a baby's head, and the door was higher than the roof of a normal house. Just as she reached the door and before she could knock, it opened on its own. My grandmother slowly stepped inside, scanning her surroundings with her eyes. As she entered, the door closed behind her. Inside the house, Candles illuminated the space, with lanterns made of white paper lining the walls in 2 rows, with 9 lanterns in each row. The house was supported by 7 massive wooden columns, several times larger than village pillars, each bearing a Chinese inscription that my grandmother couldn't read. The floor was paved with stone slabs, each about 3 feet long. The building was vast, occupying about 1 acre of land, and in the center stood the largest of the 7 columns. Wooden panels were attached around it, spiraling upward like an endlessly tall staircase without a visible roof. But my grandmother was not alone. Inside, there were about 10 other people, all with the same fearful expressions as hers, standing in silence and gazing at each other in disbelief. One afternoon, after finishing her work in the fields, Grandma took steps to go home. The road from the field to her house was not too far, just a short distance. Suddenly, Grandma felt darkness engulfing her, the world spinning, and the sky abruptly turning black as if someone pulled a cloth to cover it. Her ears started ringing, followed by a piercing sound that made her head ache, and then she fainted, losing consciousness. When she woke up after a while, she saw that the sky was still bright. She gathered her belongings and hoe and continued on her way home. Today, the road from the field to her house seemed strange. The houses on both sides of the road had disappeared. The newly built brick houses had turned into 2-leaf thatched houses. The once rice fields had turned into a barren land, overgrown with weeds and wild grass. Feeling something was not right, Grandma hurriedly walked straight home. As she walked, the scenery became increasingly unfamiliar. Unlike any other day, the wide stone road had turned into a muddy path. The thatched houses looked dilapidated and far from affluent. Grandma tried to recall her memories and realized that this might be a scene from many years ago. As the evening approached, filled with worry for her children at home who hadn't had a meal, Grandma ran desperately to find her house, but to her surprise, she couldn't find her own house. She ran back and forth several times but couldn't see it anywhere. Clearly, Mr. Ba's house was on the left, Mrs. High's house was on the right, but Grandma's house was nowhere to be found. Panicked because it was getting dark, Grandma continued walking in fear. As she walked, she grew tired and weary, and then she saw a very large building in front of her. She didn't know how many floors it had, but its exterior was painted in a deep red color, with a black roof, wooden doors, and a doorknob as big as a child's head. The door itself was taller than the roof of an ordinary house. Just as she reached the door and before she could knock, the door opened by itself. Grandma slowly stepped inside, scanning her surroundings with her eyes. As she entered, the door closed behind her. Inside the house, there were candles lighting the place, with white paper lanterns surrounding them, arranged in 2 rows of 9 lanterns each. The house was supported by 7 large wooden columns, several times the size of normal pillars, and each wooden column had a Chinese character written on it that Grandma couldn't read. The floor was paved with stone, each stone about 3 steps long. The building was spacious, covering about 1 hectare of land, and in the center of the house was the largest pillar among the 7. It had wooden pieces around it, spiraling upwards like a towering staircase with no end in sight. But Grandma was not alone. There were about 10 other people inside, all with the same fearful expression as Grandma. They stood still, staring at each other with suspicion. They all looked equally exhausted, as if they had just traveled a long distance. The weariness and anxiety were evident on each person's face. Each of them chose a corner for themselves and quickly settled down. In the middle of the night, everyone was awakened by a loud noise, the clanging of iron chains, cries of despair, and mournful wails. Grandma woke up. The door slowly opened. A person with a white face, disheveled hair hanging down, and 2 hands chained with 2 thick chains like ropes appeared. Their neck was locked in a wooden collar, reminiscent of ancient prisoners. They were escorted by 2 massive figures, muscular and fierce-looking, with long, sharp fangs. They forcefully dragged the person inside, despite their fierce screams and endless cries. The 3 of them arrived in front of the central pillar in the house, and then an invisible force seemed to pull them upward, and they disappeared. Everyone became chaotic, scrambling to run out of the building, then each went their separate ways. Grandma, on the other hand, continued walking, both walking and running, trying to stay away from the horrifying scene she witnessed earlier. After a while, the sky brightened again, and Grandma found herself back in the field from the previous day, still holding her hoe and carrying her belongings, beginning her search for the way home. The road was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Grandma kept walking, and occasionally, she saw people coming and going, some standing in front of their houses, looking at her with curiosity. Some walked by and smiled at her, but Grandma didn't recognize any of them. She searched her memories again, trying to figure out which road led back home. She saw Mr. Ba's house and Mrs. High's house, just like the previous day, but her own house was nowhere to be found. Grandma thought about her 5 children and wondered how they were doing. She worried if her eldest son had cooked a proper meal for the younger ones, if the 2 youngest had managed to bathe. Were they scared being alone at home? Grandma had never left her 5 children alone at home for such a long time. Tears streamed down her face, but she kept walking, clinging to a glimmer of hope. She walked until her legs grew weary, then she stopped in front of the house from the previous day. With no other choice, Grandma stepped inside and searched for a place to rest. Inside, the scene was the same, and there were still a few people inside, but today, Grandma counted only 8. They still looked at each other suspiciously, with an expression of scrutiny, then each found a corner to sleep in. As night fell, everyone was once again awakened by the same noise as the previous night. 2 cold-blooded demons dragged a woman inside. The woman wore white clothes, her hair disheveled, her whole body wet and pale from the cold. As she entered, she knelt down, pleading for mercy and forgiveness. But these 2 demons had no humanity left. They grabbed her by the hair and dragged her to the central pillar, and she disappeared into thin air. Chaos ensued once again as everyone rushed out of the house, fleeing in the same direction. And so, the cycle continued. The sky would darken, then brighten again. Grandma would find herself standing between the field of the previous day and embark on her journey once more. This repeated over and over again, and Grandma counted that it had happened 7 times, from dawn till dusk. Strangely, with each passing day, the number of people in the house dwindled. Today, only 4 people remained. Having grown accustomed to the current situation, the suspicion and doubt towards each other diminished. The 4 people gathered and engaged in conversation. One of them shared a story of being on the way to visit a sick relative when they got into a car accident. When they regained consciousness, they found themselves standing alone on the road, as if nothing had happened. The other person involved in the accident was nowhere to be found, and the car was gone as well. They tried to find their way back home but had been searching for 9 days without success. The surrounding scenery had also changed, and where their house used to be, there was now only a small canal. Despite their efforts, they couldn't find it. The group continued sharing their own stories, each one as puzzling and bewildering as the next. They were trapped in an endless loop, a cycle without escape, and the mystery of their predicament remained unsolved. By now, everyone had vaguely understood the problem. They had all fallen into the same situation, trying to find their way home but feeling helpless. The ones who didn't return may have found their homes already. Thinking about it gave everyone a glimmer of hope but also a shared fear. They wondered who would be the only person to return here in a few days. On the 12th day, Grandma suddenly stopped trying to find her way home and instead headed towards Grandpa's house. She quickly found her way there. Seeing Grandpa splitting firewood in front of the house, Grandma called out emotionally, "Husband." Grandpa paused, looked up, and threw the machete to the ground before rushing over to embrace Grandma. He asked, "Oh heavens, why are you here?" Grandma sobbed, "You're so cruel, leaving me all alone. Your father blamed me for the death of our child. Then he kicked me and our 5 children out of the house. At that moment, I wanted to die with you, but when I thought about our 5 young ones, I bit my lip and left. I've been searching for them for 12 days now. I don't know how they're doing, and if something happens, how can I go on living?" Grandpa wiped away Grandma's tears with a cloth and comforted her, saying, "Be calm. I didn't want things to turn out like this either. I couldn't do anything when your father kicked you out. I even dreamt about warning him, but he didn't respond. So I had to hold back my tears. I tried to protect you and our children. But why did you end up here?" Grandma explained tearfully, "I was walking back from the fields but couldn't find our house. At night, I saw a tall building where people were sleeping. In the middle of the night, a demon brought a soul to me, and I was so scared that I ran away. That's how the past 11 days passed. But today, I didn't try to find my way back. Instead, I searched for your house, never expecting to meet you at this moment." Grandpa wiped the remaining tears from Grandma's face and said, "Oh, my dear. This is not a place for the living. The building you entered is Tanhuang Temple. Normally, people passing by see it as a small shrine hidden under the bamboo bushes at the crossroads. But for the spirits, it's where the local deities reside, and all the affairs of the deceased, overseen by the king of the underworld, must be brought before Tanhuang Temple before they are allowed to capture the souls. I died from a bomb explosion while cutting bamboo, and my karma hasn't been settled, so Tanhuang Temple allowed me to stay here until my karma is exhausted, and only then can I be reincarnated. The scenery here is delayed by 10 years compared to the living world. Our house was built just 2 years ago, so it's no wonder you couldn't find it. But why, my dear, did you end up here? You haven't reached the realm of death yet? I plan to return and see you and the children in 3 days, so I don't understand how you ended up here. Indeed, no matter how my grandfather asked, my grandmother couldn't figure out the reason why. She went to work, then fainted, then woke up and just kept walking without knowing the destination. That is the result of your karma. A voice echoed, startling both of them. They looked towards the road and saw a monk dressed in tattered robes, holding an alms bowl and walking barefoot. My grandfather raised his folded hands and asked, "Venerable sir, what do you mean by the result of her karma?" The monk replied, "There is a female ghost that has been following you since the day you were alive. She developed an affection for you, so when you got married and had children, she resented both of you. Day and night, she haunted and harmed you, and it was she who caused you to cut the bamboo that year. However, the female ghost can only have emotions for humans, not for male ghosts. That resentment transferred to your wife here, and 12 days ago, she attempted to take her soul for revenge. I witnessed it and intervened, trapping the ghost in this vessel. Today, all 3 of us will settle our debts, and I will guide her to reincarnation." After saying that, my grandfather opened the alms bowl, and a cloud of white smoke emerged, condensing into the form of a woman standing in front of them. That woman must have been very beautiful when she was alive, and if she were to reconcile with my grandfather, it would indeed be a perfect match. In his youth, my grandfather was the most handsome man in the village, and his family was well off. On the other hand, my grandmother wasn't particularly attractive, but she was skilled, capable, and responsible enough to raise 5 children on her own. My grandfather's decision to marry my grandmother surprised many people in the village. To ensure my grandmother wouldn't be at a disadvantage, my grandfather organized a grand wedding, treating the whole village to 2 cows. They lived together for 5 decades without ever having a loud argument. Later, my grandfather became a military driver and had an affair, which my grandmother discovered and confronted him, resulting in a major fight that led to their separation. The female ghost looked at my grandmother with eyes full of resentment and longing. She desperately wanted to take my grandmother down here to seek revenge for her lost love. With 3 faces, the female ghost explained, "I've been infatuated with him since we were young. Unfortunately, I lost my blessing early on, and ever since, I've been lingering in this place, unable to move on. I've watched him grow day by day, and I wanted him to be mine. I hate you for seducing him, for stealing my lover away. If I were still alive, I would be his wife, and I would bear his children, not you." Then the female ghost burst into mournful cry. Although my grandmother was somewhat frightened, she stood her ground. "Even if you take him along after death, he will still escape from you. He is my husband, the father of my children. It is heaven's will that has arranged it this way, and you cannot change fate." Grandfather saw the 2 women arguing because of him, and he felt uneasy in his heart. He said to the female ghost, "Be silent. This is not my fate. This is your selfishness. Now I know that you caused my death, so don't expect me to follow you. Even in the next life, I don't want to meet you. I will choose my own wife. If I can't, I would rather become a tree or grass than be with you. Ask the master to find a way for you to be reborn, otherwise, you will never attain liberation." The female ghost continued to cry out loudly with resentment. Grandma said, "Now that I'm here, if you let me go back to my children, I will do whatever you want." The female ghost suddenly stopped crying and clenched her teeth. She said, "I want to tear open your belly and see how big your heart is to dare to steal him away from me." Saying that, she thrust her sharp fingernails directly into Grandma's stomach, tearing it apart on both sides. Grandfather rushed forward, but it hadn't been long since his passing, and he didn't have enough spiritual energy to stop this evil spirit. He knelt down and begged the master for help. The master had his eyes closed all this time and heard the plea. He asked grandfather to open his mouth and said, "I won't let her harm your wife. But let those 2 women resolve it between themselves. This matter will end here, and there will be no more entanglements." Grandma screamed in pain as her stomach was torn apart, experiencing extreme suffering. Then she felt as if something heavy was pressing on her stomach, making it difficult for her to breathe. Suddenly, a hand pulled her shoulder forcefully. Grandma heard a voice echoing in her ears, "Wake up, wake up, Hai Dang, wake up." That hand pulled Grandma back to the present. She slowly opened her eyes, at first blinded by the light, but then it gradually subsided, and she saw a blurry figure sitting next to her. When her eyes adjusted to the light, she recognized it was Aunt Hai, the neighbor. Aunt Hai had come to visit Grandma. She leaned against Grandma's stomach, hearing her groan, and assuming she had regained consciousness, she helped Grandma up. Aunt Hi quickly shouted to let everyone know, then whispered to Grandma, "Thank goodness. We were planning to hold a funeral for you. The clothes are all prepared here. If you hadn't woken up, you would have died for real in a few more days." After 12 days of being in a coma, Grandma was emaciated, her breathing weak, unable to speak clearly, and could only survive on seawater. But having her soul return to her body was already a stroke of luck. Grandma lay motionless in bed for another month before recovering. I was truly chilled by Grandma's story. In the past, she would only mention in passing that on the 12th day, she met Aunt Hi, who asked a few questions and helped her up. But she never mentioned meeting Grandfather again or the female ghost that had harmed her. A month before that, Grandma had been experiencing persistent stomach pain. She went to see a private doctor, who diagnosed her with gastric pain and gave her medication. But the pain only intensified. In September of that year, the girls took Grandma to Choray Hospital for examination, and the doctor concluded that she had multiple liver tumors. She was sent back home. In October of the same year, she passed away at the age of 71.